let's review those 4 facts that I said are established by the majority of New Testament scholars today. First, Jesus' burial in the tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Richard has never disputed that tonight, and yet that is extremely important because the belief in Jesus' resurrection could never have arisen in Jerusalem in the face of an occupied tomb. What about the evidence for the empty tomb? First of all, I mentioned the burial account supports it, and Richard doesn't deny it. Secondly, I said that the empty tomb is multiply attested in early independent sources. Richard asserted that the Passion story was constructed out of Old Testament text, but I showed, in fact, from Qumran apocalypticism and post-biblical historiography that that doesn't happen, that there are many events in the Passion story for which no parallels exist in the Old Testament, and on the other hand, there are obvious things in the Old Testament that weren't picked up in the Passion story. Now, what Richard says here is, well, in Acts, the author simply makes up these speeches. Well, that doesn't work in the case of Acts because Acts is filled with non-Lucan Semitisms, traces of early Aramaic speech on the part of the disciples. And this has suggested to a good number of scholars that what we have preserved here are independent traditions that Luke had of the early apostolic sermons, and they refer to the empty tomb. So I don't think we've seen any grounds for thinking that the empty tomb is not, in fact, multiply and independently attested, which gives us good grounds for believing in it historically. I suggested, thirdly, that the women witnesses lend credibility to the empty tomb story. And here Richard says, oh, but women did serve as witnesses in Jewish courts of law. What he's talking about is passages from the Mishnah, which is 200 years after the time of the gospel events. Moreover, when you look at these passages, what you find out that women can serve as witnesses on is only 2 things. They can only serve to witness in court to 2 things. First, they can testify to their virginity when they were married, in case their husband accuses them they weren't a virgin. Secondly, a woman can testify that her husband is dead so that she can prove that she's a widow. That's all they can do. I think that serves to emphasize the point that I'm making, that the testimony of women just wasn't regarded on a par with men's. In any case, what Josephus said probably represented the general prejudice of his time, that women were too lightheaded and brash to serve as credible witnesses. Now, Richard says, but look, Josephus relied on the testimony of women in 2 cases in his work. Yes, precisely because no male witnesses were available. He's talking about the testimony of women who were the only survivors of the slaughters at Gamala and Masada. And this actually goes to prove my point. This is the only place in the corpus of Josephus where he uses women witnesses. And why does he do so here? Because there were no male witnesses. They were the only survivors of the slaughters. The fact that the women are witnesses shows that Josephus isn't making this up, but he is relying on what witnesses he had. And the gospel writers find themselves in exactly the same situation. He says, well, then I mentioned that the gospel accounts of the empty tomb are simple and untouched by legendary or theological embellishment. And he says, yes, they are. Look at the coincidences of the people's names, for example. Well, here I think Richard's speculations just go off the rails. He says that the 2 Marys at the empty tomb are symbols. Now, understand that 1 out of every 4 women at that time was named Mary. This was a very common name. But Richard says that Mary is like Miriam, and she was the sister of Moses, who was the leader of Israel, so Mary is a symbol for Israel, the promised land. And Mary Magdalene, he says, was from Magdala, which is a variant of the word tower, which is transcribed in the Septuagint as Magdalon, which designates the town of Migdol, which represents the borders of Egypt. So she is a symbol of Egypt, which is a symbol of death. Now, this is just hermeneutical speculation gone off the rails. It's a good hermeneutical principle that before you try to read the lines, you got to learn to read the lines. Before you try to read between the lines, you have to learn to read the lines, that is to say. And I don't think Richard has learned to do that yet. He says, well, it serves as irony. It's the reversal of expectations. But as I said, there is no reversal of expectations in the Gospel of Mark. It fulfills Jesus' predictions. Look at Richard's examples of reversal of expectations. James and John asked to sit at Jesus' right and left hand in glory. Now, what's the reversal of expectation supposed to be? Well, it says Jesus was crucified between two thieves. How is that any great motif of reversal of expectation? This is purely constructed and concocted. I think, as Robert Gundry says, the Gospel of Mark contains no hidden meanings, no sleight of hand, no Christology of irony that means the reverse of what it says. Mark's meaning lies on its surface. And when Richard gets into these symbolical speculations, well, all bets are off. What about the construction of the event from the Psalms? He says it's constructed from Psalm 24. Well, Psalm 24 is a liturgy that mentions the king's triumphal entry into Jerusalem and the temple. It has nothing to do with tombs, and Mark says nothing about Jesus as king. The only connection with Psalm 24 is the phrase, the first day of the week, and even that isn't identical in Greek. So again, this is just all fanciful in Richard's mind. I don't think that there's any persuasive grounds here for thinking that this is a literary creation. 5, the Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. He says this appears only in Matthew. Right. Matthew felt obligated to refute this Jewish rumor. He wouldn't refute the rumor unless it was going around, and that rumor was that the body had been stolen, and that's why it was missing. And I think this goes to support the empty tomb. So I think we've got 5 good grounds for affirming the historicity of the empty tomb, and that's why, in fact, most scholars do support it. I didn't quote Gary Habermas as my support for that. I quoted Jakob Kramer, who is an Austrian specialist, and you remember said by far most exegetes support the empty tomb. What about the point about Paul's testimony? Let me have let me have slide 19, if I may here. There are 3 absurd theses that Richard defends that need to be gotten out on the table here with regard to Paul's teaching. The first of these is that the Corinthian error that Paul sought to correct was the belief that because Christ was already a spiritual man, he could rise from the dead while leaving his earthly body in the grave, while we could not. Nobody thinks that this was the Corinthian error. Absurd thesis 2, that the resurrection body is identical with what Paul called our inner man, which is growing inside us and will finally come out at the resurrection in an organized form like Casper, the ghost. Those are Richard's words. This absurd interpretation has more in common with the movie Alien than with Pauline thought. Paul nowhere identifies the inner man in Christ with the resurrection body. And the third absurd thesis is that the spiritual resurrection body we have is really part of Christ's resurrection body and therefore of God himself. This turns Paul into a Buddhist who thinks that we return like a drop to the ocean and denies personal immortality in contradiction to Paul. So I think that Richard's exegesis is just fanciful here. He's an admirable bibliographer, but honestly, Richard's just hopeless as an exegete. This is crank exegesis, which no Pauline scholar would accept.